Picture this. You're standing at one of the most prestigious shooting ranges in the country, where champions are made and legends are born. The air is thick with tension and the metallic scent of gunpowder. Elite marksmen in expensive gear line the firing positions, their custom rifles gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Then, a woman in simple clothes walks in carrying an old, worn rifle that looks like it belongs in a museum rather than a championship. The whispers start immediately. Snickers echo through the range. Some competitors can barely contain their laughter. After all, this is the 300-meter precision shooting championship, a place where millimeter accuracy separates winners from losers, where careers are built on the smallest margins of error. But what these seasoned shooters didn't know was that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for generations. They had no idea that the quiet woman they were dismissing would not just compete. She would completely rewrite the record books with a performance so extraordinary that it would force the entire shooting community to question everything they thought they knew about talent, preparation, and the true meaning of excellence. This is the story of how one woman's 10 shots didn't just hit their targets, they shattered expectations, broke barriers, and proved that greatness often comes in the most unexpected packages. Margaret Chen had never intended to become a legend. At 42 years old, she worked as a night shift factory supervisor at a textile plant in Ohio, a job that required her to be on her feet for 12 hours straight, managing production lines and solving problems that arose in the dim hours between midnight and dawn. Her hands, calloused from years of manual labor, bore the permanent stains of machinery oil and fabric dye. She lived in a small apartment above a Chinese restaurant, where the constant aroma of garlic and soy sauce had long since become unnoticeable to her. Most people who knew Margaret would describe her as unremarkable. She was quiet, keeping to herself during breaks at work, eating her packed lunch alone while reading paperback novels from the library. She had immigrated to America 15 years earlier with her late husband, carrying nothing but hope and a fierce determination to build a better life. When he died in a construction accident 3 years ago, Margaret channeled her grief into work, taking on extra shifts and saving every penny she could. The only unusual thing about Margaret's routine was her weekly visits to the old shooting range on the outskirts of town. Every Sunday morning, while most people were either sleeping in or attending church services, Margaret would drive her aging Honda to Pine Valley Range, a no-frills facility that charged $5 for an hour of range time. The building was nothing special: corrugated metal walls, concrete floors, and fluorescent lighting that buzzed constantly. But for Margaret, it was sanctuary. She had started shooting as a teenager in rural China, where her grandfather, a former military officer, had taught her to hunt small game to supplement the family's meager food supply. Her grandfather had been a patient teacher, showing her how to control her breathing, how to find the natural pause between heartbeats, how to become one with the rifle. Shooting is not about the gun, he would tell her in Mandarin, his weathered hands guiding hers. It is about understanding yourself completely. Those lessons had stayed with her through decades of change, through integration, marriage, loss, and survival in a country that often seemed indifferent to her existence. The rifle she brought to Pine Valley Range was the same one her grandfather had given her, a basic bolt-action model that was older than she was. The wooden stock was worn smooth by countless hands, and the metal showed patches of honest rust despite her careful maintenance. To any observer, it looked like something that belonged in a historical display rather than in the hands of someone serious about shooting. The other regulars at Pine Valley Range had grown accustomed to seeing Margaret on Sundays. They nodded politely when she arrived, but few made any effort to engage her in conversation. She was clearly skilled. Anyone watching her shoot could see that her shots grouped tightly together. But she kept to herself, speaking only when spoken to, and then only briefly. Her English, while fluent, carried a heavy accent that some people seemed to find difficult to understand, though Margaret suspected that some of them simply weren't making the effort to listen carefully. On this particular Sunday in October, Margaret noticed an unusual amount of activity at the range. There were more cars in the parking lot than she had ever seen, and she could hear animated conversations coming from inside the building. When she entered, she saw a crowd gathered around a bulletin board near the front desk. Curious despite her natural reticence, she approached to see what had captured everyone's attention. The flyer posted on the board announced the upcoming Great Lakes Regional Precision Shooting Championship to be held at the prestigious Riverside Range and Sporting Club, about an hour's drive away. The competition would feature 300-meter precision shooting, with categories for different rifle classes and experience levels. The entry fee was $200, and the first prize was $5,000, along with automatic qualification for the national championships. More importantly to Margaret, the flyer mentioned that all entry fees would be donated to local veterans organizations. "You thinking about entering, Margaret?" asked Joe Sullivan, a retired police officer who was one of the few people at Pine Valley who regularly spoke with her. Joe was a large man with a grey mustache who had been shooting competitively for over 20 years. He had watched Margaret shoot many times and had always been impressed by her consistency, though he had never seen her push herself beyond the standard 100-meter targets that Pine Valley offered. Margaret studied the flyer carefully. $200 was a significant sum for her, nearly a quarter of her monthly rent, but something about the competition called to her. Perhaps it was the mention of the Veterans Charity, reminding her of her grandfather's military service. Perhaps it was simple curiosity about how her skills would measure against serious competitors. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a desire to test herself against a challenge worthy of the lessons her grandfather had taught her so many years ago. "I am considering it," she replied quietly, her accent making the words sound more formal than she intended. Joe's eyebrows rose slightly. He knew that Margaret was a good shot, but competitive precision shooting was an entirely different world from casual range practice. "It's pretty serious competition," he said gently. "A lot of former military, police, and people who've been shooting competitively for decades. The equipment alone that some of these guys use costs more than most people's cars." Margaret nodded, understanding his concern. She had seen competitive shooters before, with their custom rifles, precision scopes, and specialized ammunition that cost several dollars per round. Her grandfather's rifle, with its basic iron sights and hand-loaded ammunition that she prepared in her apartment kitchen, would look primitive by comparison. But as she stood there reading the competition details, Margaret felt something stirring inside her that she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't excitement exactly, but rather a quiet confidence that seemed to emerge from some deep reservoir of knowledge that her grandfather had placed within her. She thought about his words. "Shooting is not about the gun. It is about understanding yourself completely." Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into preparation with the same methodical intensity she brought to every aspect of her life. She researched everything she could about competitive precision shooting, studying the rules, the scoring system, and the techniques used by championship-level marksmen. She spent her lunch breaks at the factory reading articles about wind reading, ballistics, and mental preparation. In the evenings, she practiced dry firing exercises in her apartment, working on her breathing and trigger control. Most importantly, she began pushing herself at Pine Valley Range. She convinced the range owner to let her shoot at longer distances, setting up targets at 200 and eventually 250 meters. The other shooters began to take notice as Margaret consistently placed shots within the size of a quarter, at distances that challenged even experienced marksmen. Word spread quietly through the local shooting community about the unassuming factory worker who was putting up impressive groups with an ancient rifle. The weekend before the competition, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She asked for the following Monday off work, the first personal day she had requested in over 2 years. She drove to Riverside Range and Sporting Club to scout the venue and familiarize herself with the facilities. Riverside was unlike any shooting facility Margaret had ever seen. The clubhouse looked more like an exclusive golf resort than a shooting range, with marble floors, leather furniture, and trophy cases displaying awards from decades of competitions. The ranges themselves were architectural marvels, with covered firing positions, electronic target systems, and wind flags placed at regular intervals to help shooters read environmental conditions. As Margaret walked through the facility, she overheard conversations between staff members about the upcoming competition. They spoke of famous shooters who would be attending, former Olympians and military champions whose names were legendary in the precision shooting world. Margaret began to understand that she wasn't just entering a local competition. She was about to step into the arena where the sports elite gathered to test themselves against the very best. Standing at the 300-meter firing line, looking down range at targets that appeared impossibly small at that distance, Margaret felt a moment of doubt. The magnitude of what she was attempting suddenly became clear. She would be competing against people who had dedicated their lives to this sport, using equipment that had been specifically designed for this exact purpose, at a distance that would test every aspect of her skill and preparation. But as she stood there, Margaret heard her grandfather's voice echoing across the years. "The target does not know how much your rifle cost. It does not care about your reputation or your equipment. It only knows whether your shot was true or false." That evening, Margaret returned to her apartment and spent the night preparing her ammunition with extra care. weighing each charge of powder to the nearest tenth of a grain and examining each bullet under a magnifying glass. She cleaned her rifle with the same attention to detail she applied to everything in her life, then wrapped it carefully in the old blanket she had carried it in for decades. As she lay in bed that night, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From her grandfather's patient lessons in rural China to the factory floors of Ohio, from the loss of her husband to this unexpected opportunity to test herself against the best marksmen in the region. She had no illusions about her chances of winning, but she had something perhaps more valuable than optimism. She had the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have prepared as thoroughly as possible, and that the outcome, whatever it might be, would reveal exactly what you are capable of achieving. The next morning, Margaret would wake before dawn, dress in her simplest clothes, and drive to Riverside Range carrying her grandfather's rifle and the lessons he had taught her about understanding herself completely. She had no way of knowing that she was about to walk into the most extraordinary day of her life, or that her 10 shots would not only hit their targets but would fundamentally change how an entire community viewed talent, preparation, and the true meaning of excellence under pressure. Margaret arrived at Riverside Range and Sporting Club at 6:30 in the morning, 30 minutes before registration was scheduled to begin. The parking lot was already filling with expensive pickup trucks and SUVs, many bearing bumper stickers from various shooting organizations and military units. She parked her Honda between a pristine Ford F-350 with custom wheels and a Mercedes sedan, feeling acutely aware of how out of place her modest vehicle appeared among the obviously expensive automobiles surrounding it. As she walked toward the clubhouse carrying her rifle case, a simple black canvas bag that had seen better days, Margaret noticed how different she looked from the other early arrivals. Most of the competitors wore specialized shooting shirts with patches indicating their achievements, cargo pants with multiple pockets for ammunition and accessories, and expensive shooting glasses. Many carried aluminum rifle cases that looked like they could survive a nuclear blast, and several had wheeled carts loaded with spotting scopes, chronographs, and other equipment that Margaret couldn't even identify. Margaret was wearing her best jeans, clean but showing their age, and a simple blue sweater that she had bought at a discount store 3 years earlier. Her only shooting-specific equipment was a pair of basic hearing protection and the canvas rifle bag that had belonged to her grandfather. She had considered buying new clothes for the competition, but decided that the money would be better spent on ammunition for practice. Inside the clubhouse, she approached the registration table, where a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled hair was checking in competitors. The woman looked up as Margaret approached, her professional smile faltering slightly, as she took in Margaret's appearance and obvious nervousness. "First time competing?" the woman asked, her tone suggesting that she had already reached some conclusions about Margaret's prospects. "Yes," Margaret replied simply, handing over her entry fee and cash crisp $20 bills that she had carefully counted out the night before. "You'll be in Division C, iron sights only," the woman said, barely glancing at the registration form that Margaret had filled out in her careful handwriting. "That's perfect for beginners." The pause before the last word was slight but unmistakable. Margaret nodded and accepted her competitor number 47, along with a schedule of events and a map of the facility. As she walked away from the registration table, she could hear whispered conversation starting behind her, though she couldn't make out the specific words. The next 2 hours were a blur of preparation and observation. Margaret found herself assigned to firing point 15, roughly in the middle of the line of competitors. She used the time to study the wind flags positioned at various distances downrange, noting how they moved in response to the gentle breeze that was beginning to pick up as the sun climbed higher. She also watched the other competitors as they set up their equipment, trying to learn from their preparation rituals. The shooter assigned to the firing point next to hers was a man in his 50s named Robert Henley, whose military-style haircut and confident demeanor suggested extensive experience with competitive shooting. His rifle was a work of art, a custom bolt action with a scope that probably cost more than Margaret made in 6 months. As he methodically unpacked his equipment from multiple cases, Robert glanced over at Margaret's simple setup with undisguised curiosity. "That's an interesting rifle," he said, nodding toward Margaret's grandfather's weapon, which looked even more humble next to his high-tech equipment. "What year is it?" 1952, Margaret answered, checking her ammunition one final time. Robert's eyebrows raised. "Wow, that's practically an antique. Does it still shoot straight?" "We will find out," Margaret replied with a slight smile. As the morning progressed, word began to spread through the competitor ranks about the woman with the ancient rifle who planned to compete with iron sights against some of the region's best marksmen. The reactions ranged from polite confusion to barely concealed amusement. Several competitors made excuses to walk past Margaret's firing point, ostensibly to check wind conditions or visit the bathroom, but clearly wanting to get a closer look at what they obviously considered a curiosity. Margaret was aware of the attention, but chose to focus on her preparation. She had learned long ago that other people's opinions, while sometimes painful, had no effect on her ability to perform whatever task was at hand. At the factory, she had endured similar skepticism when she was first promoted to supervisor, with some workers questioning whether someone with her background could effectively manage production lines. She had answered those doubts not with words but with results, and she intended to take the same approach here. At exactly 10 o'clock, the range officer called all competitors to the firing line for the safety briefing and final instructions. Margaret found herself surrounded by men and women who carried themselves with the confidence of experienced competitors. Many wore shooting jackets covered with patches indicating their achievements, national championships, military marksman badges, and tournament victories stretching back years. The range officer, a former Marine named Colonel Peterson, explained the rules with military precision. Each competitor would fire 10 shots at 300-meter targets, with scoring based on the total number of points achieved. The targets featured 10 concentric rings, with the center X ring worth 10 points, and each successive ring worth 1 point less. A perfect score would be 100 points with 10 X's, though such scores were extraordinarily rare at this distance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Peterson announced, his voice carrying clearly across the range, "you have 60 minutes to complete your string of 10 shots. You may fire them at your own pace, but once you begin, the clock does not stop." Wind conditions are expected to remain relatively stable, with a slight crosswind from the southwest at approximately 5 to 8 miles per hour. As the competitors returned to their firing points for final preparation, Margaret could hear fragments of conversations around her. Several marksmen were discussing their predictions for winning scores, with most agreeing that anything above 90 to 5 points would be competitive, and that the winner would likely need a score in the high 90s with multiple X's. "What do you think you'll shoot?" Robert asked Margaret as they both prepared for the start of the competition. Margaret considered the question carefully. She had never shot at 300 meters under competitive conditions, and she had no reliable data on how her rifle would perform at this distance with the ammunition she had prepared. "I hope to do my best," she answered diplomatically. At exactly 11 o'clock, Colonel Peterson's whistle signaled the start of the competition. Margaret watched as other competitors began their shooting sequences, most taking considerable time between shots to check wind conditions, adjust their positions, and carefully squeeze their triggers. The sound of rifle fire echoed across the range as competitors began working through their 10-shot strings. Margaret spent the first few minutes simply observing. She watched the wind flags, noting how the breeze seemed to follow a pattern, strengthening and weakening in roughly 2-minute cycles. She observed how the mirage rising from the heated concrete affected visibility at different times. Most importantly, she listened to her grandfather's voice in her memory, reminding her of the lessons he had taught her about patience, breathing, and the importance of shooting only when everything felt exactly right. After 5 minutes of careful observation, Margaret loaded her first cartridge and settled into her shooting position. Unlike many of the other competitors who used elaborate shooting rests and adjustable stocks, Margaret shot from a simple prone position, using only a basic bipod that she had borrowed from Joe Sullivan at Pine Valley Range. She closed her eyes briefly, running through the mental checklist that her grandfather had taught her decades earlier. Breathing steady and controlled, heart rate calm and regular. Muscle tension minimal but consistent, mind clear of all distractions except the task at hand. When she opened her eyes and looked through her iron sights at the distant target, everything else seemed to fade away. Margaret's first shot surprised her with its clarity. Despite the distance and the relatively crude sighting system compared to the high-powered scopes used by other competitors, she could see exactly where she needed to aim. Her breathing naturally settled into the rhythm her grandfather had taught her, and when the trigger broke, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Through the spotting scope provided by the range, Margaret could see that her first shot had hit the 9-ring, slightly right of center. A solid start, but nothing spectacular. She made a minor adjustment to compensate for the wind and began preparing for her second shot. As Margaret worked through her shooting sequence, she began to notice that some of the other competitors were finishing their strings much more quickly than she was taking. Several marksmen had already completed all 10 shots and were packing up their equipment, apparently satisfied with their performance. Margaret, however, was taking her time with each shot, waiting for the wind to settle and for her breathing to reach the perfect rhythm before taking each shot. By the time Margaret fired her 5th shot, another solid hit in the 9-ring, She realized that most of the other competitors had finished. The range was much quieter now, with only a handful of shooters still working through their strings. Margaret could feel eyes on her, and she sensed that some people were watching her performance with interest that seemed to go beyond mere curiosity. Her sixth shot felt perfect from the moment she squeezed the trigger. The recoil seemed softer than usual, and she somehow knew, before looking through the spotting scope, that this shot had found its mark. When she checked the target, she saw that the bullet had indeed hit the X-ring, her first 10 of the competition. The seventh shot was even better. Margaret felt herself settling into a rhythm that seemed almost meditative, as if the external world had faded away and only she and the distant target existed. This shot hit the X-ring as well, and Margaret began to understand that something special was happening. By the time she prepared for her eighth shot, Margaret noticed that the range had become unusually quiet. Other competitors who had finished their strings were gathering behind the firing line to watch her complete her sequence. She could hear whispered conversations, though she couldn't make out the specific words. Margaret's eighth shot was her best yet, hitting the exact center of the X-ring with what looked like perfect precision. The whispers behind her grew more animated, and she heard someone say something about consecutive X's that she didn't quite catch. As she prepared for her ninth shot, Margaret felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. All the nervousness and self-doubt that had plagued her earlier in the day had evaporated, replaced by the quiet confidence that came from knowing she was performing exactly as her grandfather had taught her. This shot, like the three before it, found the X-ring with what appeared to be supernatural accuracy. Margaret's final shot of the competition would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. As she settled into position for the 10th time, the entire range fell silent, except for the gentle sound of wind, flags fluttering in the breeze. Even Colonel Peterson, who had officiated hundreds of competitions, found himself holding his breath as Margaret prepared to complete her string. The shot, when it came, was perfect. The bullet hole appeared in the exact center of the X-ring, so close to her previous shots that several competitors would later swear that all 5 of her final bullets had gone through the same hole. As Margaret set down her rifle and removed her hearing protection, the range erupted in amazed conversation as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. Margaret Chen, the quiet factory worker with the antique rifle, had just fired 5 consecutive X's to complete a shooting performance that no one present had ever seen matched at 300 meters with iron sights. The silence that followed Margaret's final shot lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, as if someone had suddenly turned up the volume on the entire world, the range exploded into animated conversation. Competitors who had packed up their equipment rushed back to the firing line to get a better look at Margaret's target. Range officials hurried down range with measuring devices and magnifying glasses, their usual composed professionalism replaced by obvious excitement. Margaret herself remained calm, methodically clearing her rifle and packing her equipment with the same careful attention she gave to everything in her life. She was aware of the commotion around her, but chose to focus on the familiar routine of post-shooting maintenance, cleaning her grandfather's rifle with the same reverence she had shown it for decades. "Ma'am, we need to verify your target," called Colonel Peterson, approaching Margaret's firing point with a clipboard and what appeared to be official measuring equipment. His military bearing remained intact, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was struggling to maintain his usual composure. Margaret nodded and followed the range officer down range, accompanied by a growing crowd of competitors, range officials, and spectators, who had gathered to witness what everyone sensed was an extraordinary moment. As they walked the 300 meters to the target line, Margaret could hear fragments of conversations around her, most expressing disbelief at what they had apparently witnessed. 5 consecutive X's with iron sights? That rifle has to be 70 years old. I've been shooting competitively for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that.
Who is she?
Where did she come from? When they reached Margaret's target, the crowd fell silent again. Even from a distance, it was clear that something remarkable had occurred. The target, which had started as a clean white sheet with concentric scoring rings, now bore 10 distinct bullet holes, arranged in a pattern that defied belief. The first 5 shots formed a tight group in the 8, 9, and 10 rings respectable shooting by any standard. But the final 5 shots told a different story entirely. Those 5 bullets had all found the X-ring, the most difficult scoring area to hit consistently at any distance, let alone 300 meters, with basic iron sights. Even more incredibly, 4 of the 5 X-ring hits appeared to be touching each other. with the fifth shot placed so close that the entire group could be covered by a quarter. Colonel Peterson pulled out a magnifying glass and began the official scoring process, carefully examining each bullet hole while two other officials recorded the results. The crowd pressed closer, everyone wanting to witness the verification of what was clearly going to be an exceptional score. Shot number 1, 9 points, just outside the X ring to the right, Peterson announced in his clear, military voice. Shot number 2, 9 points, good hit in the 9 ring. Shot number 3, 10 points, solid X. As Peterson continued through the scoring process, the excitement among the observers grew with each call. Margaret's first 5 shots had produced a respectable score of 47 points, with 1 X-ring hit. But as Peterson moved to the final 5 shots, his voice took on a quality that suggested even he was having difficulty believing what he was seeing. Shot number 6, 10 points, X-ring center. Shot number 7, 10 points, X-ring center. Shot number 8, 10 points, X-ring center. Shot number 9, 10 points, X-ring center. The crowd held its breath as Peterson examined Margaret's final shot, using the magnifying glass to carefully verify the bullet hole's location. The pause seemed to last forever, though it was probably no more than 30 seconds. Finally, Peterson straightened up and announced in a voice that carried clearly across the range, shot number 10, 10 points, X-ring center. The mathematical calculation was simple but stunning. Margaret had fired a perfect score of 97 points out of a possible 100, with 6 X-ring hits. More importantly, her final 5 shots represented shooting of a precision level that most competitors had only read about in shooting magazines or heard described in legendary stories from national championships. But Peterson wasn't finished with his verification. According to competition rules, when a score was extraordinary enough to potentially set records, officials were required to measure the actual group size, the distance between the centers of the farthest shots. Using precision calipers, Peterson carefully measured Margaret's final 5-shot group. "Ladies and gentlemen," Peterson announced, his voice now carrying the formal tone reserved for official record announcements. "The final 5-shot group measures 1.37 inches center to center at 300 meters. The crowd erupted in amazed conversation as people tried to process what they had just heard. A group size of less than 1.5 inches at 300 meters was exceptional shooting under any circumstances. Achieved with iron sights and a rifle that was older than most of the competitors present, it was simply unprecedented. Robert Henley, the experienced competitor who had been shooting next to Margaret, was among the first to approach her as the crowd began to disperse. His expensive equipment and decades of competitive experience had produced a respectable score of 90 to 1 points, which would have been good enough to win most regional competitions. Today, it left him in a distant second place. "Ma'am, I have to ask," Robert said, his voice mixing admiration with genuine curiosity. "How long have you been shooting competitively?" "This is my first competition," Margaret replied simply. Robert stared at her for a moment, clearly trying to process this information. "Your first competition? But the way you shoot, that group you just fired would be exceptional for someone with decades of experience." Margaret considered how to explain the lessons her grandfather had taught her. The years of practice at Pine Valley Range, the patient development of skills that had begun in rural China and continued through decades of weekly practice sessions. But she realized that no simple explanation could capture the depth of preparation that had led to this moment. "I have been practicing for a long time," she said finally. As word of Margaret's score spread through the clubhouse, a crowd began to gather around the scoring table, where officials were tabulating the final results. Margaret's 97 points had not just won the Iron Sights division, it had achieved the highest score in any division, including those competed with high-powered scopes and custom rifles that cost tens of thousands of dollars. The current facility record for 300-meter precision shooting, according to a brass plaque mounted near the range office, was 95 points, set 3 years earlier by a former Olympic team member using a rifle specifically built for international competition. Margaret's score had not just broken that record, it had shattered it by a margin that left experienced shooters speechless. But perhaps even more significant than the score itself was the manner in which Margaret had achieved it. Competitive shooting, particularly at the championship level, was typically dominated by individuals with extensive resources, specialized equipment, and years of professional coaching. The sport had evolved into a highly technical discipline where success often depended as much on equipment capabilities as on individual skill. Margaret's performance challenged every assumption that the competitive shooting community held about what was necessary to achieve excellence. Her ancient rifle, basic equipment, and complete lack of competitive experience had somehow produced results that surpassed shooters who had invested decades and tens of thousands of dollars in pursuit of similar achievements. As the afternoon wore on and the final scores were officially tabulated, Margaret found herself at the center of attention in a way that was both uncomfortable and unexpected. Competitors approached her throughout the day, some seeking advice about shooting technique, others simply wanting to examine her rifle and understand how such extraordinary accuracy was possible with such basic equipment. Margaret answered their questions politely but briefly, explaining her grandfather's teachings about breathing and trigger control, describing her practice routine at Pine Valley Range, and showing interested competitors the hand-loaded ammunition she had prepared in her apartment kitchen. But she could sense that many people were struggling to understand how these simple elements could combine to produce the performance they had witnessed. The awards ceremony that evening was held in the clubhouse's main dining room, an elegant space with wood paneling and oil paintings depicting hunting and shooting scenes from the club's 100-year history. Margaret felt out of place among the formally dressed attendees, but she had been specifically invited by club officials who seemed to understand that they had witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. When Colonel Peterson called Margaret to the podium to receive the first-place trophy, the applause was sustained and genuine. As she stood there holding the award, a substantial crystal piece that reflected the dining room's chandelier lighting, Margaret thought about her grandfather and the lessons he had taught her so many years ago in rural China. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the patient years of practice, the weekly sessions at Pine Valley Range, the careful preparation of ammunition in her small apartment. Most of all, she thought about her grandfather's words. Shooting is not about the gun. It is about understanding yourself completely. Standing in front of a room full of accomplished marksmen who were still trying to understand what they had witnessed, Margaret realized that she had finally demonstrated the full depth of her grandfather's wisdom. Her 10 shots had not just hit their targets, they had proven that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected places, achieved through dedication, patience, and a deep understanding of fundamental principles that no amount of expensive equipment could replace. The trophy ceremony marked the end of the competition, but Margaret sensed that in many ways her shooting journey was just beginning. As she drove home that evening, her grandfather's rifle secured in its simple canvas case and the crystal trophy carefully wrapped in the passenger seat. She had no way of knowing that news of her performance was already spreading through the competitive shooting community like wildfire, carried by competitors who couldn't wait to share the story of the factory worker who had redefined what was possible with an antique rifle and iron sights. Margaret returned to her normal routine the Monday morning after the competition, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She arrived at the textile factory for her night shift at exactly 11:30 p.m., just as she had for the past 5 years. Her supervisor, a harried man named Dave, who rarely paid attention to anything beyond production quotas, barely glanced up when she punched her time card. "Chen, line 3 is running behind schedule," Dave called out as Margaret hung up her jacket. "They've got some tension issues with the new synthetic blend. Think you can sort it out?" Margaret nodded and headed toward the problematic production line, her mind already shifting into the analytical mode that her job required. As she worked to diagnose and correct the machinery problems, the crystal trophy sitting on her kitchen table and the memory of 5 consecutive X-ring hits seemed to belong to a different world entirely. But even as Margaret tried to return to a quiet, unremarkable life, word of her performance was spreading through shooting communities across the region and beyond. Robert Henley, the experienced competitor who had witnessed Margaret shooting firsthand, had posted a detailed account of the competition on several online shooting forums that same Sunday evening. His description of Margaret's performance, particularly her final 5-shot group with iron sights, generated immediate and intense discussion among precision shooting enthusiasts. Within 48 hours of the competition, Margaret's story had been shared and reshared across dozens of shooting-related websites, social media groups, and online communities. The photographs of her target, showing the impossibly tight group in the X-ring, were downloaded and analyzed by shooters around the world who struggled to believe that such accuracy was possible under the conditions described. The story reached mainstream shooting publications within the week. American Rifleman magazine contacted Riverside Range and Sporting Club requesting verification of the scores and details about the unknown competitor who had achieved them. Precision Shooting magazine assigned a staff writer to investigate the story and attempt to locate Margaret for an interview. But perhaps the most significant attention came from the National Rifle Association's competitive shooting division, which maintained official records for precision shooting achievements across various disciplines and distances. When they received the official score sheets and target photographs from the Great Lakes Regional Championship, Several records officials spent considerable time verifying the documentation before acknowledging that Margaret's performance appeared to represent multiple new records for iron sight shooting at 300 meters. Margaret remained unaware of most of this attention. She didn't use social media, rarely read shooting magazines, and had no connection to the online communities where her story was being discussed and analyzed. Her life continued its established pattern: work at the factory, grocery shopping on Wednesday evenings, laundry on Saturday mornings, and shooting practice at Pine Valley Range on Sunday mornings. It was Joe Sullivan who first told Margaret about the attention her performance was generating. When she arrived at Pine Valley Range for her regular Sunday session 2 weeks after the competition, Joe was waiting for her with a stack of printed articles and forum posts he had collected from various shooting websites. "Margaret, you need to see this," Joe said, his excitement barely contained. "You've become famous in the shooting world. People are talking about what you did from here to California." Margaret accepted the papers with polite curiosity but obvious confusion. As she read through the various accounts of her performance, she was surprised by the level of detail and analysis that shooters had applied to her 10 shots. Several ballistics experts had calculated the mathematical probability of achieving her final 5-shot group, with estimates ranging from 1 in several thousand to essentially impossible under normal circumstances. One particularly detailed analysis posted by a former Marine sniper instructor concluded that Margaret's group size represented shooting that exceeded the accuracy capabilities of most rifle and ammunition combinations, regardless of the shooter's skill level. This writer suggested that Margaret had somehow achieved a perfect convergence of environmental conditions, equipment performance, and human skill that might never be replicated. "I don't understand why people are so interested," Margaret told Joe as she finished reading through the articles. "I just tried to shoot my best." Joe laughed, though not unkindly. "Margaret, what you did isn't just shooting your best. It's shooting better than almost anyone thought was possible with that equipment. You've got people questioning everything they thought they knew about precision shooting." As the weeks passed, the attention continued to grow. Margaret began receiving phone calls at home from journalists, shooting instructors, and equipment manufacturers who wanted to interview her or learn more about her techniques. She politely declined most of these requests, explaining that she preferred to keep her shooting as a private hobby rather than something that attracted public attention. But some opportunities were too significant to ignore. When the National Shooting Sports Foundation invited Margaret to attend their annual industry summit as a guest speaker, she felt obligated to accept. The foundation explained that her story had captured the imagination of the shooting community precisely because it demonstrated that extraordinary achievement was still possible without the expensive equipment and extensive support systems that had come to dominate competitive shooting. Margaret's appearance at the Industry Summit in Las Vegas marked her first venture into the world of competitive shooting beyond her regional competition. The conference brought together thousands of industry professionals, competitive shooters, and enthusiasts from around the world. Margaret found herself somewhat overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of an event that seemed to represent everything she was not: wealthy, well-connected, and deeply embedded in the shooting industry's culture. Her presentation, scheduled for the final day of the conference, was held in the main auditorium and drew an audience of over 800 people. Margaret had never spoken to a group larger than her factory shift of 12 workers, and she approached the podium with visible nervousness that endeared her to the audience even before she began speaking. "I am not sure why so many people are interested in what I did," Margaret began, her accent slightly more pronounced due to her nervousness. "I learned to shoot from my grandfather in China, and I have been practicing the same way for many years. I think maybe people make shooting too complicated sometimes." For the next 20 minutes, Margaret described her grandfather's teachings about breathing, trigger control, and mental preparation. She explained her practice routine at Pine Valley Range and demonstrated the simple techniques she used to prepare her ammunition. Most importantly, she shared her grandfather's philosophy that shooting excellence came from understanding yourself completely, rather than from expensive equipment or complex techniques. The audience's reaction was unlike anything the conference organizers had experienced in years of similar events. Margaret's quiet sincerity and obvious lack of pretension created a connection with listeners who were accustomed to presentations focused on technical specifications and product marketing. When she finished speaking, the applause continued for nearly 2 minutes, an unusual display of enthusiasm at a conference where polite professionalism was the norm. Following her presentation, Margaret was approached by representatives from several major rifle manufacturers who wanted to provide her with custom equipment for future competitions. She was offered endorsement contracts, invitations to shooting schools, and opportunities to work with professional coaches who could help her develop her competitive career. Margaret listened politely to these offers but declined them all. She explained that she was satisfied with her grandfather's rifle and saw no reason to change equipment that was performing well for her. More fundamentally, she expressed concern that becoming involved in the commercial aspects of competitive shooting might change her relationship with the sport that had provided her with peace and satisfaction for so many years. This decision puzzled many industry professionals who couldn't understand why someone would turn down opportunities that most competitive shooters would consider career-defining. But Margaret's choice resonated strongly with recreational shooters, who felt that the sport had become overly focused on equipment and commercialization at the expense of the fundamental skills and personal satisfaction that had originally drawn them to shooting. Over the following months, Margaret's story continued to influence discussions within the shooting community about the role of equipment versus skill in achieving excellence. Several shooting schools began incorporating elements of her grandfather's teaching methods into their curricula, emphasizing breathing control and mental preparation over technical equipment adjustments. More significantly, Margaret's performance inspired a new category of competition specifically designed for shooters using basic equipment. The traditional marksman division, adopted by several regional shooting organizations, limited competitors to rifles manufactured before 1970 and iron sights only, creating opportunities for shooters who couldn't or didn't want to compete against custom equipment. Margaret was invited to serve as the honorary starter for the first traditional marksman championship held at Riverside Range the following year. As she stood at the firing line watching competitors prepare for the same challenge that had changed her life, Margaret reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with her grandfather's patient lessons in rural China and continued through decades of quiet practice at Pine Valley Range. She thought about the phone calls from journalists and manufacturers that still came occasionally, the magazine articles that mentioned her performance, and the young shooters who sought her advice at competitions she attended. But most of all, she thought about her grandfather's words about understanding yourself completely, and how that understanding had somehow translated into 10 shots that not only hit their targets, but had fundamentally changed how an entire community thought about the relationship between equipment, training, and excellence. Standing there watching the next generation of traditional marksmen prepare for their competition, Margaret realized that her grandfather's lessons had achieved something beyond even perfect shooting scores. They had reminded an entire community that the most advanced equipment in the world could never replace the fundamental human qualities of patience, dedication, and deep self-knowledge that formed the true foundation of any lasting achievement. 5 years after her record-breaking performance at the Great Lakes Regional Championship, Margaret Chen found herself standing in a place she never could have imagined visiting: the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. She was there for the dedication of an exhibit titled Precision and Perseverance: The Evolution of American Marksmanship, and prominently featured in the display was her grandfather's rifle alongside the target from her historic shooting performance. The invitation to include her rifle in the Smithsonian exhibit had come 18 months earlier, accompanied by a letter explaining that museum curators considered her achievement to be historically significant, as an example of individual excellence transcending technological advantages. The letter also noted that her story had inspired measurable changes in competitive shooting practices across the country, making her performance worthy of preservation as part of America's sporting heritage. Margaret had initially been reluctant to part with her grandfather's rifle, even temporarily. The weapon had been her constant companion for decades, accompanying her through immigration, personal loss, years of factory work, and countless Sunday mornings at Pine Valley Range. But the museum's assurance that the rifle would be returned after the exhibit's 2-year run, combined with their explanation of the educational value her story might provide to young visitors, eventually convinced her to agree to the loan. Standing now in the museum's sporting history gallery, Margaret looked at the display case that contained her grandfather's rifle, alongside artifacts from Olympic competitions, military conflicts, and other significant moments in American shooting history. The placard beside her rifle told the story of her performance in simple, factual language, but Margaret knew that no written description could capture the full significance of what had happened that day at Riverside Range. The changes that had followed her performance went far beyond what anyone could have predicted. Within 2 years of her record-breaking score, the traditional marksman division had been adopted by shooting organizations in 37 states. Equipment restrictions similar to those Margaret had voluntarily imposed on herself. Rifles manufactured before 1970, iron sights only, hand-loaded ammunition had created opportunities for thousands of shooters who had felt excluded from a sport increasingly dominated by expensive technology. More importantly, Margaret's story had influenced how young people were introduced to competitive shooting. Several youth programs had restructured their curricula to emphasize fundamental skills rather than advanced equipment, based on the principle that students who mastered basic techniques would be better prepared to utilize sophisticated equipment when they were ready for it. The National Rifle Association had established the Margaret Chen Fellowship, a program that provided training opportunities for young shooters from disadvantaged backgrounds. The fellowship specifically sought out students who demonstrated dedication and natural ability, but lacked access to expensive equipment or professional coaching. Each fellow received instruction in traditional marksmanship techniques, along with equipment loans that emphasized reliability over sophistication. Margaret herself had become reluctantly involved in some of these programs, primarily through visits to shooting clubs where she would demonstrate her techniques and answer questions from young marksmen. These appearances were always brief and informal. Margaret remained uncomfortable with public attention, but her simple explanations of breathing control, trigger discipline, and mental preparation consistently impressed instructors who had been teaching similar concepts with far more complexity. One such visit to a youth shooting program in rural Virginia had particularly touched Margaret's heart. The club served primarily students from farming families who were interested in shooting, but whose parents couldn't afford the equipment typically associated with competitive marksmanship. Margaret spent an afternoon working with a dozen teenagers, all using basic rifles and iron sights similar to her grandfather's weapon. "My family can't afford a fancy scope," one student had confided to Margaret during a break in the instruction. "Does that mean I can never be really good at this?" Margaret's response drew on decades of her grandfather's wisdom. "The most expensive equipment cannot teach you to breathe properly or to understand your natural rhythm. Those things come only from practice and patience. If you master those fundamentals with simple equipment, you will be prepared to excel with any equipment." The student, a 15-year-old girl named Sarah, whose family raised cattle in the Blue Ridge Mountains, would go on to win 3 traditional marksman championships over the following years, using a rifle that belonged to her great-grandfather and techniques that Margaret had taught her that afternoon. Stories like Sarah's had multiplied across the country as the traditional marksman movement grew. Shooting clubs in rural areas, which had struggled to compete against urban clubs with sophisticated equipment budgets, found new relevance in competitions that emphasized skill over technology. Veterans organizations embraced the traditional approach as a way to honor shooting heritage while making the sport accessible to members with limited resources. The impact extended beyond competitive shooting into the broader gun ownership community. Margaret's story had been embraced by firearms enthusiasts, who viewed her performance as validation of their belief that responsible gun ownership was rooted in skill, respect, and personal responsibility rather than in the acquisition of advanced equipment. Several manufacturers had paradoxically capitalized on Margaret's success by marketing traditional rifles that recreated the simple, reliable designs of earlier eras. These companies recognized that Margaret's achievement had created demand for equipment that prioritized accuracy and dependability over complex features and modern styling. But perhaps the most meaningful change, from Margaret's perspective, was the shift in how the shooting community discussed excellence and achievement. Before her performance, competitive shooting conversations had often focused heavily on equipment specifications, technical modifications, and the latest advances in optics and ammunition technology. Margaret's record had forced the community to acknowledge that human factors, training, mental preparation, physical conditioning, and technical skill remained the primary determinants of shooting performance. Her achievement with basic equipment had reminded experienced marksmen that the fundamentals their grandfathers had taught them were still relevant in an era of space-age technology. The academic world had also taken notice of Margaret's story. Sports psychology researchers at several universities had studied her performance as an example of how long-term, patient skill development could produce extraordinary results under pressure. Their studies focused particularly on her ability to improve her performance as the competition progressed, achieving her best shooting during the final 5 shots when pressure was greatest. These researchers identified several factors that they believed contributed to Margaret's success. Her long history of solo practice, which had developed exceptional self-awareness, her consistent routine, which provided stability under stress, and her focus on process rather than results, which allowed her to maintain concentration throughout the competition. Their findings influenced training programs for athletes in various sports, leading to greater emphasis on mindfulness, routine development, and pressure management techniques that echoed the lessons Margaret had learned from her grandfather decades earlier. As Margaret stood in the Smithsonian that day, surrounded by visitors who read the story of her achievement with obvious admiration, she thought about the conversation she'd had with her grandfather more than 30 years earlier when he first taught her to shoot. He had emphasized that shooting was merely a vehicle for learning deeper lessons about discipline, patience, and self-understanding. Looking at her rifle in its display case, surrounded by artifacts from Olympic competitions and military victories, Margaret realized that her grandfather's wisdom had proven more prophetic than either of them could have imagined. Her 10 shots at Riverside Range had indeed taught important lessons about discipline and self-understanding, but not just to her. They had somehow conveyed those lessons to an entire community of shooters who had forgotten that excellence could emerge from the most fundamental principles. The museum visitor standing next to her, a middle-aged man wearing a veteran's cap, was reading the display placard with obvious interest. When he noticed Margaret watching, he gestured toward the rifle and said, "Amazing story. Makes you think about what's really important in shooting, doesn't it?" Margaret nodded, remembering her grandfather's voice across the decades. Shooting is not about the gun. It is about understanding yourself completely. Looking at the crowds of visitors who were learning about her story and thinking about the thousands of young shooters who had been inspired by the traditional marksman programs, Margaret realized that her grandfather's lessons had found their way to a much larger audience than either of them had ever dreamed possible. As she walked through the museum's other exhibits that afternoon, Margaret reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple decision to enter a shooting competition. She had intended only to test her skills against serious competitors and perhaps contribute to a veterans' charity. Instead, her 10 shots had started a movement that was still growing years later, continuing to influence how people thought about excellence, preparation, and the relationship between human skill and technological advancement. The crystal trophy from that long-ago competition still sat on Margaret's kitchen table, but she now understood that her real achievement hadn't been captured in any score or record. Her lasting legacy was the reminder she had given to an entire community that the most sophisticated equipment in the world could never replace the timeless qualities of dedication, patience, and deep self-knowledge that formed the foundation of any meaningful accomplishment. That evening, as Margaret prepared to fly back to Ohio and return to her quiet life at the textile factory, she carried with her the knowledge that her grandfather's simple lessons about breathing, trigger control, and understanding yourself completely had somehow transcended one woman's shooting performance to become wisdom that would influence generations of marksmen she would never meet. In achieving perfect accuracy with 10 shots, she had accomplished something far more significant than breaking records. She had helped preserve and pass on the fundamental principles that made excellence possible in any endeavor, regardless of the tools available to pursue it.